High Flying Dice has traditionally published DTP games. That means games that came in a Ziploc bag that had unmounted counters. You had to mount them and cut them by yourself. And now they have decided to become more professional, and they started publishing games with different quality of components. They started publishing games that come in a box. The box is pretty much a counter holder with the material, with the cover that just fell on the floor, and with the rule books and maps, basically between the counter holder and the plastic cover. And I wanted to try games in this new philosophy, and I also simply was interested in this game that I'm showing you today. And this game is A Test of Metal. This is a game that covers 3 battles that took place in September 44 on the Western Front, and they were basically 3 attempts from the Germans to counterattack against the Allied Blitzkrieg. The game is labeled a 3-pack game. I don't know if that's supposed to be 3 games, and actually the game does come with 3 rule books, 1 for each battle. But the 3 rule books are very similar to one another. 80% of the books is just the same from a book to the other. So to me, pretty much this is a single game with 3 scenarios and specific rules for each scenario. Not that there's anything wrong about this, I just wanted to point that out to avoid possible misunderstandings. So I tried all of the scenarios, and now I'm going to tell a little bit about the system in general, about the system of rules shared by all the battles, and then I will share my impressions about the game with you. The game relies on a chit pull mechanic. That means that the units are divided in formations, and formations are activated when an activation marker for that formation is drawn from a cup randomly. The activation markers are placed in the cup, and then each turn players just draw the markers so that the players do not know exactly the order in which the units and the formations will be activated. Here, however, there is a twist to this well-known mechanic. As you can see from this example, each formation is represented by several activation markers. These are all the markers for the first toss, and as you can see, each activation marker has an indication that tells you the number of units that will be activated by that marker. If I draw this marker from the cup, then I can activate all units of the first toss. If I draw this one, then I can activate a die roll of units, 3 units, 2 units, only 1 unit, which is pretty bad if you draw that one. And what is tricky here is that only the first marker counts. If I draw this marker from the cup and it is the first toss marker that I draw, I'm going to activate 3 units of that formation, and then I'm going to ignore all the other markers that I'm going to draw, if all the other markers are in the cup. Because the game will give you instructions about the number and type of markers that will go in the cup, and by modifying that, the game is able to actually represent a lot of different factors that are affecting the general situation. For example, in some scenarios you may be allowed to choose the markers that you're going to place in the cup. In other scenarios in which you're at disadvantage, maybe you'll be forced to place them randomly, and in that case, of course, your mix of markers may not be as effective. The ally player receives airstrike markers at the beginning of most turns, depending on the weather and whether or not it is a night turn. And these airstrikes can be used to attack units on the board, or they can be used for air interdiction. Each marker that is spent to generate air interdiction will add 2 markers of the opponent to the cup. So as you can see, by using air interdiction, you can degrade the quality of the activation markers of the opponent significantly, because if I only have this marker, then I want that marker to be my only marker in the cup. If the opponent forces me to add more markers, then of course that increases the chances that I will not have an effective activation when a marker for that formation is drawn from the cup. At the beginning of most turns, you roll to determine the number of air support markers that the ally player receives. Then in some turns you may also have to roll for weather, and weather of course will affect several factors on the board. Then you start drawing activation markers and you activate the units that can be activated by that marker and that you choose to activate in case it is an activation that applies only to some of your units. Units that are activated can move up to their full movement allowance if they do not attack, and the movement allowance is printed there, or they can attack adjacent units using their full firepower if they are not moving that turn. And units have two types of firepower. One at the bottom left is used against armor, and the other one is used against infantry. Well, a unit could move up to half of its movement allowance and then attack with half of its firepower, or vice versa. There are also special types of attacks. For example, a firepower that has an L printed by it can be used at long range against a unit that is up to 2 hexes away. There's also another type of attack, which is the overrun that you execute when you're actually entering the hex of the opponent. In that case, however, the opponent can execute defensive fire first and can manage to push you back. If that doesn't happen, if you're still there, then you can execute offensive fire, and some units receive a bonus for executing offensive fire in the same hex of the opponent, that is, when they're executing overruns. Another important thing about movement, though, is that units in this game do not project a zone of control. You can move adjacent to enemy units and keep moving without any sort of restriction or penalty. And this takes some getting used to, because it is not something that you see in many games. And of course, it represents a challenge for the defender. If in a certain battle you are the defender and you're trying to prevent the opponent from reaching a certain objective, then you really have to be careful, because the enemy is going to be much sneakier than the enemy would be in other games. In any case, we're talking about attacks. Resolving attacks is very simple. You roll a die, you may have to modify the result based on several factors, for example, terrain. If the modified result is equal to or less than the attack factor that you're using, then you manage to disrupt the opponent. A disrupted unit receives a marker there, and that unit cannot move or attack as long as it has that marker on it. A second hit on that unit, that is a hit on a disrupted unit, will force the unit to be flipped to its hit side, and a hit on a unit that is on its hit side and is disrupted will eliminate the unit. However, it is not that easy to eliminate enemy units, because at the end of each turn you remove all disrupted markers from the board, and units on their hit side roll a die, and on a roll of 1 or 2 the unit is flipped back to its non-hit side. That means that in order to eliminate a unit, you really need to concentrate fire and to inflict a lot of damage in a single turn. Otherwise, units can recover quite easily, or relatively easily, in this game. When you're done with the activation of a unit, you should turn that unit by 90 degrees. That indicates that the unit was activated and cannot be activated again for that turn. At the end of each turn, all of the units that have not been turned by 90 degrees can be activated with a limited activation, and they can move up to half of their movement allowance, or they can attack adjacent units. That's it. They cannot move and fire, or they cannot move their full movement allowance. And this is pretty much gameplay. This is a very simple game. You simply keep activating units by using limited or full activations, and you play until the end of the scenario when you count victory points. Victory points are assigned to players for elimination of enemy units, occupation of villages at the end of each day of the scenario, and also the German player can receive victory points by exiting units from the edge or edges indicated in the scenario instructions. The system is very simple, and I like games that have the chat pull mechanics, and I really like to see the mechanic here, and I also like to see the twist that the mechanic has received in this game. I think that there is really a lot that can come out of the fact that you can affect the counter mix of the opponent, you can affect the markers that go in the cup of the opponent, and then also that the scenarios may modify that depending on different circumstances. That really helps the theme taking place in a way, coming to life without you having to worry about too much. Simply the quality of the counter mix will determine certain aspects of the theme that then you have to work around, you have to factor in and to try to turn to your advantage. I have to say that something that I found not easy to adjust to at first was the lack of zones of control. Thematically, it seemed a little strange. In terms of gameplay, the first time that I played, to me, just didn't make any sense. As the LA player, if I just left a single hole open there, then a lot of German units could rush through it, exit the edge from the X that would give them victory points. I would just score a ton of points that way. Then I started adjusting to that. I started figuring out that, well, this is the situation. Then I had to react accordingly. I started creating stronger lines, and when that would not be possible, I started leaving holes open in certain areas that would not be too beneficial for the German player. Actually, maybe that there would be ways to tempt the German player to divert towards a certain area, and then I would just close that area and leave the hole somewhere else if I could not block the entire line. So there are just interesting challenges that come out of this once you get used to the idea, which for many wargamers will be completely counterintuitive just because it is not very common. It is not easy to destroy enemy units, and as I said, because of the lack of zones of control, it is easy to slip around enemy units. So for the German player, maybe the temptation will be, well, why would I ever fight? I'll just spread out as much as I can and just move around the enemy units, exit the map and gain points. Yes, but this leaves you at the mercy of the activation markers. Think about this. If you're in the middle of nowhere and you are basing your strategy only on maneuverability, then you draw the counter that allows you to activate only one unit. That unit moves to the full movement allowance, and then all the other units are moving very little because they have the limited activation. So it is true, you can take advantage of mobility, but the activation markers can be tricky, and the LA player may be pretty nasty by using a lot of their interdiction against you to maximize the effect of that. On the other hand, if you are just pushing against the enemy units, you're using attrition instead of maneuverability, it may take you a while, it is just hitting and hitting and hitting and getting nowhere, and maybe then finally getting a unit reduced. But on the other hand, you're not depending on the counter mix as much, because whether your units are activated or not, by the markers, all of your units are still granted an attack against an adjacent enemy, whether it's a full activation or a limited activation. So you have that other way of proceeding, which is just to push by being adjacent to the opponent and to keep pushing, which may be slow, may or may not be effective, but it is not nearly as affected by the activation markers as the other way. So actually it is a game that has an interesting trade-off there, especially for the German player. In a certain way, the German player may have to be more creative because of this, maybe find a balance between maneuverability and attrition. On the other hand, there are challenges for the LA player too, precisely because very often to be able to close the entire line will be impossible. If a single German unit manages to go past, then you have to readjust your defenses to try to block that unit. There are a lot of interesting challenges. Two of the scenarios playing around an hour, and those are Tough Hombres and Revanche. There is then a main scenario, which is, by the way, by far my favorite one, which is Patton's Finest. And this is a longer scenario. It easily may take 3 hours or more to play, lasts several days in terms of events that take place in the game. There is weather that needs to be taken into account, reinforcements that need to be brought in, and there's a strategy around that, how you bring them in. So that to me is the meatiest game of the package, and it is also my favorite one. I welcome the new quality of components that we have in this game as opposed to other games by the same publisher, and I found the system to be easy to learn, not so easy to get used to maybe, but interesting to get used to. And once you get used to the idea, I think it is a system that presents a lot of challenges, and definitely this is a system that I have fun playing.